Dad's Diner, the best food in the house.
Hi everybody, welcome to Dad's Diner. Today I decided that I was going to make some spaghetti sauce. So I am going to share my spaghetti sauce recipe and production technique with all of you. This recipe is what I call my modified Grandma Helen recipe, because it started out with my grandmother, whose name was Helen, and when I used to go over to stay with her sometimes, she would usually make spaghetti sauce. The reason for that was because I was a very picky eater, and spaghetti and meatballs was one of the few things that she could be guaranteed that I would eat without complaining. So not only did I eat it without complaining, but it became one of my favorite things to eat. And as I got older and started cooking for myself, I started making a recipe based on what my grandmother had made, and over the years I kind of modified it. I put in more vegetables than she did when I was a kid, and later on in life when I became an adult, now I don't remember if I ever actually cooked a batch of my spaghetti sauce that my grandmother ate, but she did live to be 96 years old, and so when I was older I told her about my spaghetti sauce and how it was a little different from what she served me. I said, there's more vegetables in it, and my grandmother said, I love vegetables in the spaghetti sauce. I just didn't put them in when you were a boy because you wouldn't have eaten them then. And so we had a good laugh over that. 35 years later, I was able to laugh at myself for that. So anyways, this spaghetti recipe is grandma approved and tested through many years of examples. So, without further ado, let's go make some spaghetti sauce. So here are most of the ingredients that you will need to make your spaghetti sauce. We're going to start over here on the left with the meat. Now the primary meat is going to be some Italian sausage. I like to use sweet sausage rather than hot sausage, but you can use hot if you like. And I also like to put in some stew veal. That gives the sauce a little extra meatiness, but if you don't like veal, or if you'd rather have something that's a little less expensive, you can also use something such as ground beef, even ground turkey. There are many things you can substitute, or you can just do it with the sausage alone. I find that's also a nice sauce, even with just the sausage. And the base of the sauce is, of course, tomatoes, and I use 2 cans of crushed tomatoes, which can be obtained at ShopRite or any grocery. They usually sell them in, they have them on sale in like packs of 12, so I stock up my closet with them. And then, in addition to the meat and tomato sauce, you should add some vegetables. Now, it's really up to you what vegetables you want to add, but here are my suggestions. I always throw in some bell peppers. You can see them in a bag there. I had some left over from another recipe I made last week. And 1 large yellow onion, some mushrooms, 1 eggplant, and 1 zucchini. Funny thing about zucchini, at ShopRite it always rings up on the register as green squash. I had never heard zucchini called green squash before I started shopping at the Byram ShopRite, but whatever you call it, zucchini or green squash, it goes well in the tomato sauce. So we've got all our ingredients, and now let's prepare to get the sauce made. So now that we have all of our ingredients together, we are going to start cooking. Just as a note, when I do this, it usually is an all-day project for me. You don't have to do it that way. You could probably make a pot of this in an hour or 2 if you just throw everything together in the pot at once, but I prefer to do it over the course of an entire day. I'm starting at about 8:30 in the morning, and throughout the entire day, from breakfast time until supper time, we're going to have a nice pot of spaghetti sauce bubbling away in the kitchen, which, in addition to getting our appetites up, is going to make the house smell nice. For me, the smell of a pot of sauce bubbling in the kitchen is one of the best memories I have of my own youth and growing up, so it makes the place smell like home. So the first thing we are going to do is chop up and saute some of the ingredients in the pot before we add the actual tomato sauce. So the first things we are going to start with are the veal, or other meat if you prefer not to use veal, the onion, and at least some of the mushrooms. So that is where we will begin. Now, before we start chopping up the ingredients, it's a good idea to make sure that you have sharp knives. As you may have learned in Cub Scouts, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, even home economics, the sharper your knife, the less force you have to use to cut things. Some of you are already quite familiar with this and don't need to be reminded, but in case you aren't, this is called a honing steel. It's often found in knife sets, and if you don't have a packaged knife set, it might be found in a drawer of your kitchen that you keep things that you don't recognize or remember what they are. But if you take this and you scrape the blade of the knife across it a few times on one side, a few times on the other side, you will have a nice sharp blade with which to begin your chopping. So that is step one, get those knives sharp. So the first thing you're going to want to do is slice up the onion. Now, this may irritate your eyes. This is something that everybody has to deal with. I have not found a way to not get watery eyes while chopping up an onion. If any of you have, leave me a message as to what your tips are. So I have chopped up the onions, and now I am chopping the veal. I get veal from ShopRite Meat Counter, which is marked as stew veal, and it's cut into fairly small pieces, but I like to chop it up even smaller, like pieces no larger than a nickel. It will cook quicker, and there will be more pieces per scoop, so it'll be easier to divide, and the smaller pieces I think are just tastier. It's nice to find one in there. Now, if you don't want to use veal for whatever reason, there are other meats that can do the job. Ground beef is pretty common. A lot of people make a meat sauce with ground beef. Ground pork, I find, is actually very tasty and sometimes even less expensive than ground beef. You could also use ground turkey, but personally, not a fan. You could leave the meat out entirely. I would leave out the meat entirely before I stoop to ground turkey, but it's all up to you. So now we have onions and veal and mushrooms ready to go in the pot. So now that we have our pot on the stove, we are going to saute the onions and the meat and at least some of the mushrooms before we start the sauce itself. As you know, since this is an Italian-based recipe, you must have olive oil. Now, I usually just eyeball it and put in enough oil to completely cover the bottom of the pot, but if you want a measurement, my estimate would be about 1/8 of a cup, or maybe a little more. So, using an electric range, I heat it up to a medium heat, like between a 3 and a 5 on this dial, but you know your stove best. Maybe you have a gas stove, maybe your range goes up to 11, I don't know. But now that we have the oil in the pot, we put the onions in there. There are a lot of pieces of onion. Don't worry, they will shrink and consolidate as things heat up. And you will know that cooking is taking place. You start to hear the snap, crackle, and pop with the oil heating up and the onions cooking and crisping, and before long, your kitchen is going to smell like onions. Okay, so you can see that the onions are getting cooked, getting a little bit caramelized, and there's plenty of steam, there's plenty of noise. Now, I start to put in the chopped up veal. And one of the reasons that I chopped it up so small, in addition to what I said earlier, is because I want to brown the veal. I want to get some nice browning on each side of these veal cubes. So this is something that's going to take a bit of attention, so you have to be vigilant at this point of the cooking. Make sure that the veal doesn't get overcooked, but between the oil and the natural fat from the veal itself, it shouldn't be long before you have these cubes of veal thoroughly browned on all sides. And then we will move on to the next step. So you can see right now there is a lot of action in the pot. It's bubbling away. And we have got some nice cooking fats and oils in there between the olive oil I put in earlier and the fat from the veal. And this is the difference, I think, between a homemade sauce and something you just buy at the store, because, you know, plain old jar of tomato sauce, what is that? You got to have a little bit of fat in there to increase the flavor. Anyway, these mushrooms are going to absorb those fats and oils and cook up quite nicely. You have to stir it thoroughly. The pot is starting to get full already. There's only a finite amount of room in there between, now we've got meat, we've got mushrooms, we've got onions, our sauce, which is actually going to be kind of a stew once it all gets done, is really taking shape. Now, if, as I mentioned before, you choose not to use the meat in this part, that's okay. The mushrooms will cook up quite nicely with just the onions and the olive oil. If you don't like meat or mushrooms, you poor soul, I feel sorry for you. Now, the heart of your spaghetti sauce, of course, is the tomatoes. Now, if you are a real purist, traditionalist, you grew up in Italy, or your parents grew up in Italy, then you might actually take some raw tomatoes and put them in there and mash them up and use that for your sauce. Personally, I grew up with grocery stores and canned vegetables, and so I just go to ShopRite and get a can of crushed tomatoes. There are different types of tomato products in these cans. There's tomato paste, there's tomato sauces, whatever. What I use are specifically the crushed tomatoes. So, in they go. We got one can to start with, and then we have a second can, and then we are going to stir that up because we want to get all this stuff nice and mixed. So now you got meat, onions, mushrooms, tomato sauce, and we are just going to let that simmer for a while before we go on to the next step. Okay, so now we have the sauce bubbling away, and the next thing we are going to do is add a bit of wine. Now, you don't want to add your expensive wine, you know, save the expensive Barolo for when we're celebrating the end of social distancing. If you just get some of this wine that comes in a large jug from ShopRite, that's fine for flavoring your spaghetti sauce. So this is going to add a little flavor to the sauce. It's also going to make the sauce a little less thick. So you decide, if you want to use wine, how much you want to use. I usually use a little less than a cup, but if you wanted similar effect and thicker sauce, a half a cup would do the job just fine. Now, my son has pointed out that we now have pot, shrooms, and wine. Is this stuff going to get you high? I hope not. Actually, one of the reasons that I cook this sauce over the course of an entire day is that most of the alcohol is going to have boiled off by the time we are ready to eat. But before it does, it will have flavored the sauce and it will have helped to tenderize the meat. So we're going to mix it up well, and then we are going to season it. Okay, so now the seasonings are the way that you customize your sauce and make it taste the way you like it. There are a lot of different seasonings you can put in there. The tomato paste that I used, the crushed tomatoes, actually had some basil added, so that's a good start. But I like to have my sauces really well seasoned and getting enough of that, those herbs in there to make the whole kitchen smell like an Italian cooking festival. So I like to start with what I call the Holy Trinity of Italian herbs. You should have these in any Italian tomato sauce. Parsley, oregano, and basil. You blend those three together and that's what really gives you that classic Italian herb blend smell and taste. Now, of course, those of you who come from Italian families know that garlic is a key ingredient as well. Some people like more garlic, some people like less garlic. I like to put in just enough to give it that little garlicky kick. And also, something that some people like and some don't is pepper. I don't put in much pepper, if any, but some people like it, a little hotter, a little spicier, so feel free to add the pepper. I have also heard rumors that some people actually put sugar in their pasta sauce. Not my thing, but if you do, then make it the way you like it. This is where you would put it in. So, we've got our seasonings ready. Now let's go and put them in the pot. Okay, so very simple. Add in some oregano. I'm being very generous with it, as you can see. Some parsley. I can smell it already. I wish we had smell-o-vision so you could smell how good this is. Some basil. There's already some basil in there, but a little more basil is definitely something I enjoy. The garlic powder. And just a bit of pepper, not too much. And then we just stir it all up. And now that we have a nice pot bubbling away and well seasoned, we're ready to put in the sausage. ShopRite Sweet Family. Okay, so now I put the sausage into the pot and it's going to be cooking up over the course of the day. Now, as I mentioned before, if you don't want to have the meat at the beginning, you don't have to. Sausage, however, is something that I find goes very well with spaghetti sauce and spaghetti. If you don't like any kind of meat, well then you should probably be finding somebody else's recipe, because I like meat. I use it in a lot of my cooking. Okay, so the sausage is in there and we stir it up so it's well covered. The pot is getting higher. By the time we reach the next step, which is when we put in some more vegetables, it's going to be almost filled up to the top. We got a big pot here. This can feed, I have 3 mouths to feed, 2 of which are growing boys and 1 of which is me, so that's a lot of food, but this can feed us for several days once it's done. Alright, so we've got everything except the vegetables, and we're going to add the vegetables later on. Right now you can see it is 10:44, so come back to us later in the day. We're going to let this simmer for a few hours and we'll add the vegetables soon.
5 hours later.
Okay, time to chop the vegetables. Look how colorful this is. Okay, so you will notice from the clock on the stove that it's now about 5 hours since I completed this wonderful mixture here, which has been bubbling away. And now I have all of my vegetables chopped up and ready to go in. So, some eggplant. I'm going to stir that around a bit because this all takes up space. So, we've got the eggplant in, and now the zucchini, or for those people who didn't go to school, green squash. And finally, bell peppers. Usually I have some red and some green, but these just happen to be left over from another recipe. And going to stir that in. Now the reason that I waited a few hours is because I like to have the vegetables well cooked, but I don't want them to become mush. It's a fine balance, but I do like the vegetables to retain at least a little bit of crunchiness once the sauce is ready to eat. So this, I'm going to come back later on as the vegetables soften up. I'll stir them some more, but it is now 20 of 4, and supper time is going to be around 7 o'clock. So by the time it gets to be about 6:30, so like roughly 3 more hours of cooking, this stuff is going to be all mixed together, nice, tender, flavorful, aromatic, ready for a good super supper. And there we go. Now all we have to do is let it cook. Okay, so it is now 7 o'clock. And this sauce has been bubbling away for more than 8 hours total. And we've got our vegetables, our meat, our sausage, and it looks delicious. It smells delicious. Can't wait to have our spaghetti dinner. So the only thing left to do is cook up some spaghetti, and then we will eat.